Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a company, any large organization, really. It's got all these systems, rules, controls. They're designed to make sure things run smoothly, risks are managed, regulations are followed. But who watches those controls? Who checks the checkers?
Yeah, that's exactly the core idea we're digging into today. We're diving into this document about internal audit, which is basically a function that acts as this high-level control of controls inside a company's whole governance setup.
Exactly. And our mission here is to pull out the key stuff from this source material. So by the end of this deep dive, you should have a really clear picture of what internal audit actually is, why companies set one up, or maybe why they decide not to, and why it's just so critical for good corporate governance and, managing risk properly.
And it's not just corporate buzzwords. Understanding this helps you understand a fundamental layer of how companies try to operate responsibly.
Right. So let's start with that foundation then. This whole concept of internal audit being the control of controls inside the corporate governance framework. What does that actually look like day to day or structurally?
Well, think about the board of directors. Their responsibility, especially under frameworks like the UK Corporate Governance Code, is to maintain sound systems of risk management and internal control. They can't just, say they have controls. They need some way to check they're actually working.
And it usually passed that job down.
Pretty much. That responsibility often lands with a specific committee, the audit committee. And these are typically made up of independent, non-executive directors, NEDs, people outside the daily running of the company. A really key part of their job, as the source points out, is reviewing the company's internal control and risk systems.
Okay.
But crucially, they also have this specific task: monitoring and reviewing the effectiveness of the internal audit activities themselves.
Ah, right. So you've got this independent committee looking over the function that's actually checking the controls. That adds quite an important layer of assurance.
It really does. And the document makes a point that even if a company doesn't have an internal audit function, the audit committee is expected to think about it every year to consider if one's needed.
Oh, really?
Every year. Yep. And if they decide against it, they're supposed to explain why in the annual report, which is, a pretty strong signal that it's seen as best practice, even when the law doesn't strictly require it.
That point about it being expected best practice is interesting. It leads right into the next question. If it's often not actually mandated by law, particularly outside certain specific industries, what really pushes a company to say, okay, yeah, we need an internal audit function?
Fundamentally, it comes back to the board's main job, managing risk. So when they identify a risk, they have choices, right? Accept it, transfer it, avoid it, or reduce it. If they pick reduce it, they need to put controls in place. Internal audit then becomes essentially a control over that whole risk reduction process. It's a way to check if those primary controls are actually doing what they're supposed to do.
So it's a strategic choice.
Yeah.
Really tied directly to how they handle risk. But you mentioned principles-based governance, where it's not just a legal tick box.
Yeah.
Why does the source suggest it becomes almost unavoidable as companies get bigger or more complicated?
Well, because reviewing those control and risk management systems effectively, that becomes a massive job. Yeah. And it's sensitive work. It needs people with specific skills. And maybe most importantly, it has to be done independently and objectively.
Right.
So as things get more complex, the audit committee basically have to delegate this. Trying to manage that oversight without a dedicated function just gets impractical, which is why, they need to explain its absence if they don't have one. They need to justify how else they're getting that crucial check done.
Okay, that makes sense. Complexity and needing that skilled, objective delegation, those are big drivers. What other specific things does the document mention that are like warning signs saying, hey, maybe you need internal audit now?
Well, the most obvious one is just increased risk. If the company's risk profile is going up, the need for controls goes up, and so does the need to check those controls. Simple as that, really.
Makes sense.
The source also points specifically to things like complex transactions or operating in highly regulated areas as definite triggers.
Like banking or finance?
Exactly. Handling complex financial instruments or, operating as a bank. The document actually uses banks as a prime example where you'd absolutely expect to find an internal audit function.
And is it sometimes actually mandatory in those regulated sectors?
Yes, in some specific regulated industries, it absolutely is required by law or regulation. But even where it's not strictly mandatory across the board, the level of regulatory scrutiny can be so intense. I mean, the consequences of noncompliance, like potentially losing your license to operate, can be so severe.
Yeah, huge consequences.
Right. So the source basically describes the case for internal audit in those situations as overwhelming. Plus, regulators often need specific information, and internal audit is often the best place to gather and verify that.
Okay, so beyond just general complexity and regulation, the document mentions the UK's Turnbull report, which apparently laid out some specific factors for boards to think about. What kind of things were on that Turnbull checklist?
Yeah, it's a pretty useful list for gauging the need. It includes things like the sheer scale, the diversity, and the complexity of the company's operations. Also, the number of employees, which is often a good indicator of size, maybe having lots of different locations, maybe less of a shared culture. Then there are cost-benefit considerations, obviously, changes in the company's structure, changes in the key risks it faces, any existing problems they're already aware of with their internal controls.
Right, if things are already creaking.
Exactly. And importantly, it mentions increased number of unexplained or sort of unacceptable events happening.
Ooh, that last one sounds like a pretty clear red flag.
Absolutely. If you're seeing weird things happen that you can't explain or controls keep failing, it strongly suggests there are deeper issues with how risks are being managed. And the document also connects us back to change generally. Any big shift in the company's structure or its risk environment inevitably brings new risks, which should prompt thinking about whether internal audit is needed to keep an eye on them.
So we got a good handle on why internal audit gets set up, what the triggers are, but let's dig into something you mentioned earlier that sounds critical: independence. The source really stresses that the audit committee is independent, and internal audit has to be too. Why is getting that real independence so difficult for internal auditors?
Yeah, this is probably where the biggest practical challenges lie. It's a major tension point because internal auditors are usually employees of the very company they're auditing.
Right.
And that immediately creates potential conflicts. They're basically auditing their colleagues, their departments, sometimes even decisions that could affect their own career path within that company.
What sort of conflicts or ethical threats does this source talk about?
It mentions a few key ones. Familiarity threats, just being too close, too friendly with the people whose work you're checking. Self-review threats, that's auditing work you might have done yourself in a previous role. And just general threats to independence. The document gives a really good, concrete example. Think about an internal auditor who's also an accountant. They might hesitate, consciously or unconsciously, to strongly criticize the chief financial officer, the CFO, because, well, the CFO likely has a big say in their future career prospects at the company.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Or, if someone moves from an operational role, say managing logistics, into internal audit, and then they're asked to audit the logistics systems they helped design or run. That's a classic self-review threat right there. How objective can you really be?
It's a real dilemma. Your paycheck, your promotions, they're tied to the very people and systems you're supposed to be scrutinizing with a critical eye. How do you manage that?
Yeah.
How do you actually speak truth to power in that kind of situation?
That is the fundamental problem. And the source notes that even when companies bring in external firms, contractors to do their internal audit work, those contractors are still hired by and reporting to management. So it creates a slightly different dynamic. But the potential for management influence is still there.
So the value placed on independence is really high then?
Extremely high. So high, in fact, that major regulations like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX, in the U.S. explicitly forbid a company's external auditors, the ones checking the main financial statements, from also doing internal audit work for that same client.
Oh, okay.
That's a hard line drawn specifically to protect the independence of the external audit, but it really underlines how vital the principle of independence is seen to be. And other governance codes have similar ideas.
So the Independent Audit Committee, the one with the NEDs, they aren't just supervising internal audit, they're kind of acting as a buffer or a guarantor of internal audit's ability to be independent.
That's exactly the idea. The audit committee's oversight is absolutely vital. They're the ones who should ensure internal audit's work plan, its scope aligns with the company's strategic goals. They need to make sure IA has the authority, the backing to go wherever it needs to go and look at whatever it needs to look at to scrutinize controls effectively.
Right.
And they also help ensure IA is meeting compliance needs. This reporting line, directly to an independent committee, is specifically designed to shield internal audit as much as possible from undue pressure from the management team who are, let's face it, the ones being audited. It gives IA what the source calls hierarchical congruence, the standing to operate effectively.
Okay, so we've covered the importance, the why, and this really critical challenge of independence. What about the limits? What can't internal audit realistically do, even when it's set up well and trying to be independent?
That's a really important point. While internal audit can be incredibly effective at examining operational controls, checking if processes are followed, verifying transactions, reviewing who has access to systems, that sort of thing, the document is quite clear that it's much, much harder for IA to effectively monitor controls operating at the strategic level.
And why is that distinction between operational and strategic so important here?
Well, strategic decisions are about the big picture. Fundamental business model choices, major investments, the overall direction set by the top leadership and the board. These are very different from checking if, say, a purchase order had the right approval signature.
Right, different scale entirely.
Exactly. And the document points out that even companies that had seemingly good operational controls and functioning internal audit departments have suffered massive failures that stemmed from strategic mistakes or actions that internal audit just couldn't reach or prevent.
Are there examples given in the source material?
Yes. It mentions classic cases, things like management deliberately overriding controls. Enron is the famous example there. That was fundamentally a failure at the strategic and leadership level that operational internal audit couldn't stop. Another example given is the kind of poor strategic decision-making by some banks that led to them needing government bailouts back in 2008. Even if internal audit was diligently checking lending processes down below, they weren't typically in a position to challenge the fundamental strategic direction or the overall risk appetite being set by the CEO and the board.
So it's like internal audit can check, the engine is running okay, the procedures are being followed, but it can't necessarily tell you if the captain is steering the ship straight towards an iceberg if that course was decided right at the top.
That's actually a pretty good analogy. The document is really emphatic. The board itself holds the ultimate responsibility for those strategic level controls. Internal audit is a crucial part of the overall corporate governance picture, but it relies on that bigger picture being sound. So if that broader governance framework is broken, say you have a CEO who routinely interferes with internal audit's work or ignores its findings, then internal audit alone can't fix that. That kind of interference is usually a symptom of much deeper problems at the very top.
Okay, that makes sense. So pulling it right down to the practical level, the day-to-day, what kind of things do internal auditors actually do? What does their work look like on the ground?
Well, the source lists quite a few types of audits they might carry out, which shows you how broad their potential scope can be. Things like value for money audits, information technology or IT audits, best value audits, financial audits, looking at specific financial processes, and operational audits.
That's quite a varied list. Is their scope set by law like it is for external auditors?
No, and that's a really key difference. External auditors, the ones who audit the main financial statements, have a legally defined statutory scope. They have to do certain things. Internal audit scope, on the other hand, is generally decided by the company itself.
Oh.
Specifically, it's usually set by the audit committee, based entirely on what that company's biggest risks and priorities are.
So does that mean internal audit in Company A might look completely different from internal audit in Company B?
Oh, absolutely. Completely different. In a smaller, maybe less complex business, internal audit might be quite basic checks, maybe even part-time. But in a huge, global, highly regulated company, you're likely talking about a large, sophisticated team. They'll have specialists in IT security, complex financial regulations, maybe specific industry rules, forensic accounting, you name it.
Wow.
The focus is totally driven by what the organization and its audit committee are most concerned about at that time.
Can you give a couple of quick examples of how that focus might shift depending on the company?
Sure. So if a company operates in a sector with heavy regulations like pharmaceuticals or energy, then a huge chunk of internal audit's work will likely be monitoring compliance with all those specific rules.
Yeah.
If another company is really worried about, say, theft of inventory or protecting intellectual property, then IA might focus heavily on controls around physical assets or data security. They could spend time reviewing the process for how new IT systems are designed, making sure controls are baked in from the start. Or they might focus on testing the operation of controls within existing systems. Are they actually working day to day?
Makes sense.
They might also, linking back to those Turnbull points, be tasked with checking on how well corporate objectives are actually being implemented across the business.
And the document also mentioned their role can stretch into areas like sustainability and CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Yes, that's an increasingly important area. Internal audit can play a role in monitoring how effective a company's CSR policies actually are. Are they being implemented consistently? Do the actions on the ground actually align with the company's stated environmental or social objectives?
Interesting.
The source even mentions specific external standards, like the EU's EMS scheme for environmental management and the ISO 14000 environmental standards. Both of these actually require organizations to conduct internal audits related to their environmental targets and management systems and report on them. So it really shows that internal audit's reach can go way beyond just traditional finance and operations into areas that are critical for reputation and, frankly, long-term survival these days.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together then. Internal audit is essentially that vital control of controls. It's a really integral part of the whole corporate governance system.
Right. And whether a company has it often depends on factors like its risk level, its complexity, the regulations it faces, guided by thinking like those Turnbull criteria we discussed.
And achieving genuine independence is absolutely crucial for it to work properly, often relying on that oversight from the independent audit committee. But it faces these inherent challenges because the auditors are usually employees.
Exactly. And while it's really powerful for checking operational stuff, it does have limitations, especially when it comes to those big strategic decisions. Its effectiveness really depends on the whole governance picture being sound.
And what internal audit actually does day to day is incredibly varied. It's tailored specifically to what the organization needs, covering everything from financial checks to IT systems, operational efficiency, regulatory compliance, and even checking up on CSR promises.
Yeah, and ultimately its effectiveness really boils down to the integrity and the professional ethics of the auditors themselves, and crucially, the support and authority it gets from the very top, from the board and the audit committee.
That's a really thorough look at this function that, as you said, often operates behind the scenes. Now, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. Given everything we've discussed about how absolutely critical internal audit's independence is, for it to really challenge management and make sure controls aren't just for show and acknowledging that tough reality of asking employees to essentially audit their own bosses, what practical, maybe even creative steps could companies actually take to truly protect and empower that independence? How do you build a culture or maybe put specific structures in place so that internal audit isn't just ticking boxes, but genuinely has the teeth it needs to do its job effectively, especially when things are complex or changing fast?